Okay, welcome. I'm really excited. This is the first of a four-part series on the weekly Parsha. And the idea is to look at the different characteristics of our avot and imahot, our forefathers and foremothers, to think about how those those characteristics get sort of imprinted on us as descendants of those people. Knowing that we say, right, siman avot levanim, that like the things that our forefathers did impact us directly today. So I'm going to share my screen, but everyone should feel free to also just look on their own sheet. So we're going to start with Avraham. Figure out how I can share. Oh, here we go. We're going to start with Avraham and thinking about what is one of, because of course there are many wonderful characteristics about Avraham. What is one of the characteristics about Avraham that is relevant to us today? So there's this beautiful midrash that I had never heard until I learned it 2 years ago, which talks about Avraham communicating with God. So I'm in the first source in Breishit Rabbah, where it says, "Veyomer Hashem al Avraham, Lech lecha me'aretzecha," right? So the first time that God speaks to Avraham, telling him to go forth from the land. Rabbi Yitzchak patach, Shim'i bat Uri'i v'hati aznech v'shilchi amech uvet avicha, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, mashal le'achad shehaya over mimakom makom, v'ra'a bira doleket. Hold on, I need to figure out how to let Nechama in. There she is. Hello, Nechama. We're in the first source on the page here. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, what is this time where Hashem says Lech Lecha? It is analogous to a person who travels from place to place, over mimakom lemakom, v'ra'a bira achat doleket, and sees a bira doleket, which I don't want to translate quite yet. Amar to Omar shahabira hazo below manhig. And he says, is it possible that this, so bira maybe as a castle or a building, lacks like a superintendent or a person to look after it? Heitzitz alav baal habira, amar lo anihu baal habira, right? And then the owner of the castle comes out and says, I am the owner of the castle. So what is this analogy, right? This is an analogy where someone is wandering maybe the countryside and they see like a decrepit building, perhaps, or a burning building, a building aglow. And they say, where is the person who's supposed to be calling the fire department or running the water to and from the well to put out the fire? And the owner comes out and says, I'm here, right? I've been here all along. Kach lefi shehaya avinu Avraham omer, tomar sheha'olam hazeh belo manhig, right? That Avraham says, is it possible that there's no one who's sort of the owner or the superintendent of the world? Shemanhig heitzitz alav hakadosh baruch hu v'amar lo anihu bal ha'olam. So God comes out and says, I am the owner of the world, right? I'm here. So I think this is a fascinating piece of midrash because it's very unclear on the surface of it. What is the thing that we're learning about Avraham here? What is a thing maybe that we're learning about God's relationship to the world or God's people here? But I want to suggest that the bira doleket is the key. And so a bira is some kind of castle or building, and doleket traditionally means on fire. But I want to suggest that it could also mean a glow within our tradition, at least in this place, right? Because I think Avraham is two very different kinds of people, whether he sees the world on fire or he sees it aglow. So I want to start with a glow, which is definitely the less traditional read. But Rashi says here, right, where he says, he's commenting on the midrash, Lefi shehaya Avraham Avinu omer tomar sheha'olam bli manhig, ra'a shamayim ba'aretz, ra'a shamayim beyom v'yareach b'layla v'kochavim me'irin, right? Avraham sort of stops and he looks around and he sees heaven and earth. He sees the sun by day and the moon by night and the stars shining. And Amar, afshar sheyehei davar gadol kazeh below manhig, right? Is it possible to have such a great thing that can have without it a guide, a tour guide, right? And that's where God comes in and says, I am the person, I'm the owner, right? And so from the Rashi's perspective, it's almost like I imagine that Avraham is walking around and suddenly he looks up and he sees like how gorgeous the world is, right? How amazing the flowers are, how bright the sun is, how shiny the stars are. And that's sort of like the Birah Doleket is a glow, right? There's like a shininess, a beauty to the world. And he thinks like, could something really have been made so beautiful without some kind of intention, without some kind of architect behind it? And so playing on that read, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel suggests that lift up your eyes on high. Religion is the result of what man does with his ultimate wonder, with the moments of awe, with the sense of mystery. Right? And I love that idea that like we could gain from Avraham, we could take from his characteristic that sense of awe or mystery or wonder with the world. How did Avraham arrive at his certainty that there's a God who is concerned with the world? According to the rabbis, Abraham may be compared to a man who was traveling from place to place when saw a palace full of light. Is it possible there's no one who cares for the palace, he wondered, until the owner of the palace looked at him and said, I am the owner of the palace. Similarly, Avraham, our father, right here, he's quoting Rashi, wondered, is it conceivable that the world is without a guide? The Holy One, blessed be he, looked out and said, I am the guide. It was in wonder that Avraham's quest for God began. To me, that's like a really powerful way of thinking about Avraham and approaching the world and approaching God, is that looking around and saying like, wow, everything is so beautiful. The world is aglow. I don't know if anyone has thoughts there. I thought that Rabbi Shai Held also summed it up really beautifully, saying that even if it does not motivate this midrash, right? Because doleket really means on fire. It doesn't mean aglow, right? It's not like the fire in a hearth that's aglow. It means like a raging fire. But even if that's not what motivates this midrash, wonder at the beauty of the universe and gratitude to its creator is the other pole of Jewish faith. Zev Wolf Einhorn, a 19th century commentator, expresses this well. Abraham, he writes, is like a person who sees a beautiful building and realizes that it must have had both a wise architect and a devoted owner. But since it is left to burn, he imagines it to have been abandoned. Here, Abraham senses order and confronts chaos at the same time. Like many of us, he discerns powerful reasons to believe and powerful reasons not to. And it's precisely this honesty that leads God to embrace him as a covenantal partner. So I think Rabbi Held is trying to hold both pieces. Like it doesn't really mean a glow, but how can we still learn from this midrash this idea of looking at God with this wonder at the beauty of the universe as like the driving characteristic of Abraham. Before I move on to the other perspective, like any thoughts, questions, observations?
Can I suggest another reading?
Sure.
All lighted up with the lights on.
Oh, like someone's home.
Tadlik et haor.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. So what do you think is Abraham's like characteristic that he notices that there?
Well, I'm just thinking that if you see a building with all the lights are on, then there's all the more reason to assume that there's somebody living.
Nice. So like at the time of Avraham, this idea of monotheism and recognizing our God, right? Like the one true God is not popular, but Avraham is able to look at the world and see that the lights are on, see that, like recognize that God is present. That's beautiful. I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Charles. Okay, wonderful. But so what about the like maybe sort of more disturbing idea, right? That's the ones that Charles and I suggested, I think are really nice, right? That Avraham had something in him that allowed him to recognize the divine and the special, the holiness in the world. But if we think about the Birah Doleket as a world on fire, what does that mean? Like, what about seeing that horribleness in the world is like something that we want to emulate? So here I want to start with Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who wrote this piece in his book, Radical Then, Radical Now. And he says, Abraham's bewilderment is clear. The sensitive human being gazes at a brilliantly structured universe, a splendid piece of art. He is overwhelmed by the grandeur of a sunset and the miracle of childbirth. He marvels at the roaring ocean waves and at the silent, steady beat of the human heart. The world is indeed a palace. right? I think that's a nod to the first strain of how we were thinking about this, but the palace is in flames. The world is full of bloodshed, injustice, and strife. Thugs, abusers, rapists, kidnappers, and killers are continuously demolishing the palace, turning our world into an ugly, tragic battlefield of untold pain and horror. And I think this is a subtle thing that Rabbi Sachs is doing. He's saying the world is not a fire by design, right? God didn't like create a dumpster fire of a world. It's the people, right? God created this beautiful building and we keep setting it on fire. But what happened to the owner of the palace? Abraham cries, right? It's not enough to say that we're the ones responsible. Like, where is God in that picture? Why does God allow man to destroy his world? Why does he permit such a beautiful palace to go up in flames? Could God have made a world only to abandon it? Would anyone build a palace and then desert it? Note that the owner of the palace does not make an attempt to get out of the burning building or to extinguish the flames. He is merely stating that he is the owner of the palace that is going up in smoke. It is as if instead of racing out, the owner were calling for help. God made the palace, man set it on fire, and only man can put out the flame. Abraham asks God, "Where are you?" God replies, "I'm here. Where are you?" Man asks God, "Why did you abandon the world?" God asks man, "Why did you abandon me?" Right? It's almost like, when you tell your children, well, you made the mess, you must clean it up, right? Like mommy's not cleaning the playground. Very real in my life right now, right? But I'm sure that's true with colleagues too, right? Like you caused this series of unfortunate events. I'll help you, but it's up to you to take control. And so I think that here what we see, what Rabbi Sachs is suggesting, right? What's the characteristic of Avraham is someone who is at least willing to acknowledge it. Right? Everyone else is kind of like hoping no one notices the gigantic mess in the playroom. And Avraham is saying like, oh my gosh, it's a disaster here. What do we do? And so God is turning it back to Avraham to say, you have to figure it out. But at least Avraham is noticing it. And so here, right, and interestingly, this is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel on the other side, right? He sees both perspectives. And here he says, there are those who sense the ultimate questions in moments of wonder and moments of joy. That's the nod to the first strain. Then there are those who sense the ultimate questions in moments of horror, in moments of despair. It is both the grandeur and the misery of living that makes man sensitive to the ultimate question. The world is in flames, consumed by evil. Is it possible that there is no one who cares? Right? Avraham is the first one to demand an answer to that question. We live in a world with like tons of theology. And so I think it's hard for us to imagine such a moment in our life. But I think that is what makes Avraham special here, is this idea that Avraham not only recognizes it, but calls it out. Right? The world is on fire. Things are going wrong. I think there are lots of things on fire in our world today. And instead of just not looking at them or hoping they go away or pretending they're nicer than they are, Avraham says, like, hold on, we have to talk about this. And Rabbi Getzel Davis, who is the rabbi on campus at, I believe it's Harvard for a while, he makes this analogy that I love to the burning bush and to Moshe. Like Moshe's burning bush, the burning world is a wake-up call. Perhaps we, like Abraham, can encounter God amidst destruction. How long does it take to stare at a burning bush and realize that it has not been consumed? 3 minutes, 7 minutes? If most people were walking down a street and saw a burning bush or a burning garbage can, they would either keep walking or run to put it out. But both Moshe and Abraham stopped to gaze and listen to the destruction, and both of them found God. Right? And here, I think Rabbi Davis is making an interesting point, which is that it's not just that Abraham noticed it and then kept walking, right? Apathy, or that he noticed it and took action, like some kind of strong leadership. It's that he took the time to look at the problem carefully, to stare into the destruction, right? That's like a thing that makes people uncomfortable in life. And it's hard to hold space for that in our lives, but that it's important. Right? Otherwise, you don't see the nuance or you don't see the complexity of the issue at hand. And so just running to put it out is often not really doing a service until you've taken the time to notice that it's actually on fire, and whatever that means in its nuance. So I think these are the traditional modes of thinking about Avraham in this story, right? One is like the Avraham of wonder, and one is the Avraham of uncomfortable realities, who calls out those realities for us. But there is a third beautiful strain from the Scott
Yeah.
Emmett. Yeah, please.
Before we go there, can I share my thought that I think about
Definitely.
with this kind of thing? This is Adam, by the way. It's my thing coming up. What's interesting is that this seems to be a story of like faith, but there's something like scientific about his disposition. Like he looks at the world with eyes of questioning and trying to understand. Like the famous story about Alex Fleming, who discovered penicillin, is that there was like yeast growing all over the place, but in one area the yeast wasn't growing, and he asked the question. He had like the power of observation that Moshe and Avraham have, of like why is the bacteria not growing in this one area, and then he like discovers penicillin, right? And it's like usually we think of science and faith as kind of like at odds with each other, but I think that Avraham has the characteristics of a scientist, of like looking at the world and asking, or Moshe also has the looking at the world and asking the question.
I like that.
And then I think the other thing that I was thinking about when you were talking was whether just between these different views, like is the world burning, is it glowing, like what's actually happening with the world, is that like Abraham's experience in life is that God is promising him structure, like you will have children, you will have whatever, you will have this, you will have that, and his experience is that he's kind of like wandering and meandering and not having kids for most of the narrative. And there's like the structure of like he's looking at the house and he sees the house, but then it's on fire. Like there's some kind of, obviously like the house that's there for structure is not providing structure because it's on fire, maybe. Like there's both the promise of shelter, and it's also not providing shelter because it's on fire. There's like a disconnect between the promise and the reality. And that's like a lot of Abraham's lived experience, that he's like promised a lot of children, and then he's supposed to go kill his son, and he's supposed to send away another son. Like the disconnect between the promise and his reality is like a prominent feature, which is similar to a house that's on fire. There's the promise of shelter and the reality of the fire.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think there's something very significant to the fact that Abraham is compared to a traveler, right? Someone who does not sit still. And I like that, the nuance of the structure versus the destruction piece of it. But I think also, right, sometimes it takes the movement to realizing something from a different perspective. And that's like a piece of it also, right? When you travel from place to place, you see things for the first time, you might see them with wonder, or you might look at them critically, however we think about it. When you pass the same dumpster fire every day, you become like a little bit immune to it maybe. And it takes, I don't want to say an outsider's perspective, although I think there's something significant that this is our first of our forefathers, but it just, maybe it takes like a fresh perspective to see it. And that's maybe part of the traveling piece. But Abraham also spends a good deal of time traveling, right? And going to Egypt with who he thinks is his partner in, producing a nation, and having her taken by the king of Egypt, right? I think there is what you're hinting at there as well, right? Like a feeling of a promise and then feeling that it's taken away. Even if you think as far back as Lot, right, that they're supposed to be together and then they decide to separate into their own spaces, and Avraham moves again. So certainly, I think that's a big piece of Avraham that's hinted at here. And I really like sorry, go ahead.
I just like that you had, I don't know if it was intentional, but you had to play words with like structure and destruction. Like
it was not
the word destruction is linguistically like the taking away of structure, like destructuring.
Yeah.
Kind of
I appreciated it also, as I heard myself saying it wasn't intentional though. And I like that. I think the scientific piece is important, right? That and maybe we think of them as dialectic, but they don't have to be, right? People driven by faith can still ask critical questions and make observations and test hypotheses, right? But we've sort of let science have all of that when maybe we don't have to. Yes, all good points though. Thank you for sharing them. Okay, so the third option, and we're coming from like a totally different tradition now of Chassidut as opposed to like, normal critical commentary. But the Sfat Emet, and this is from the translation by Rabbi Art Green, states that a person is essentially set aright when he forgets the vanities of the world. Forget your people and remember, that he is sent into this world to do God's bidding. Avraham was the first to cast all vanities aside and thus to draw light into the world, right? And so here, the Birah Doleket is not being destructed. The Birah Doleket is the light. It's like being like the light on the mountain of the Puritans, right? It's the light of God shining into the world. I love that play on what we think about of the light and the Birah Doleket. This is the meaning of the burning castle. This whole world was created only so that its vanities be forgotten and negated. This is the world's true fulfillment, since it is the corridor that leads into the great hall, right? That we are the hallway into Olam Haba. It is the will of the castle's owner that it be burned and consumed. Thus it is with a candle. The white fire hovers over a black consuming fire. Another typo, sorry. I obviously typed this in myself. The more the black fire consumes, the more the white light burns. So I think here there are two pieces. One is that drawing light into the world is in Chassidut is like a huge positive. And so a Birah Doleket, kind of the way that Charles, I think that you were thinking about it, right? Is like Avraham was turning all the lights on in the house, or he noticed that there was a house with all the lights on and called attention to it in the world. There is this beautiful light or Hashem here, and we should honor that, that piece. And the other piece of it is to think about the burning as like a constructive thing, right? I don't think we often think about burning that way anymore, like in the world of forest fires and destruction, right? But there are, in India, I visited India, they burn their fields like on some kind of rotation because it's supposed to enrich the crops in future years. And so there's this idea that the burning is actually very constructive. It takes away the pieces of ourselves that we don't need, and it leaves us with this really like pure, strong fire, or even after the fire is gone, like a pure, strong element that is new and shinier or better or stronger because of the fire that was there. And so we don't have to worry, right? The Rabbi Sachs group, we don't have to worry that the world is on fire. It's good that the world is on fire. That's burning off all the things we don't need. And we should feed that fire. We should encourage that fire as long as it gets us to the place of this like holy, pure, finished product at the end, because that's what leads us into the Olam Haba. So just a totally different way of thinking about the Birah at the end. But I think also here, right, that Avraham is the first one to realize he needs to burn those things off, right? The vanities and the, what was the other word? I lost it somewhere in here. Just the vanities that need to be forgotten and negated, right, within ourselves. Avraham was maybe like the first time to do like, this is a very musarifa, right, to do like work on himself and to try to shed the pieces of himself that were not serving God in his mission to let people know about this new thing in the world. So I think however we think about Avraham here, there is a strong sense that Avraham either has like this wonder that we should cultivate. That's like a very Heschel idea that we should cultivate our wonder in the world. Or he has this like strong sense of justice and he can call out injustice even when it's not obvious to everyone else, right? Like, I don't think we're talking about like the COVID fire. We're talking about some other more subtle fire. And Avraham saying like, hey, there's a fire here. And then the third option is to say, like, let's use that fire. Let's harness its power to do things that help us become better versions of ourselves. And any one of those directions is like we should be so lucky to have, right, that be a siman levanim, a characteristic that gets imprinted on us as we go forward as Bnei Israel. So that, I open it to other thoughts. That is my concluding thought.
It's a lot to think about.
Yes, definitely. And I think that it's interesting to watch Avraham, right? We get introduced to Avraham here, but we were with him for quite some time. And it's interesting to think about the motivations or his actions throughout those parshiot, whether you think about him as someone with wonder or someone with justice or someone who's working on his right, that there are lots of different ways to read some of Abraham's actions throughout the following parshiot, and that it's interesting to think about which of these things are driving or motivating him at any point.
I was thinking of one thing when you were, I forget the source that talked about how you need to stop and look at things. There's a wonderful medical writer, Jerome Bergman. Adam, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, and he's written a number of wonderful books. And in one of them, he has a chapter called "Don't Just Do Something, Stand There," which was something one of his professors said. We like to jump right in and do something, but there's an important value of just like hold it, just think for a minute, take a look. Sometimes, I mean, with the burning, and you referenced the wildfires, for many years, we used to, Smokey the Bear suppressed fire. And one of the contributing factors to the wildfires we're having now is that we haven't allowed the fire to burn and burn off the brush or whatever stuff, and then it gets much worse. So, sometimes don't just do something, stand there.
I love that. That's amazing.
I know, I like that one too.
That's great. Amazing. So next week in Vayera, we're going to think about Sarah and the power of laughter as her defining trait. This was like a more late commentary shir. That one will be a little bit more of traditional commentaries as well. And I hope everyone will join us to think about Sarah, and then we'll look at Rivka and then Yitzchak as our last component for the moment. So I hope everyone has a wonderful end to their week and a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.